Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my 12.8 tier list. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over like what I think makes champions good in solo queue in general. And then I'm going to go through pretty much every champ that I think can be played mid. This video will definitely be longer than like tier lists that might come after because I'm going to have to explain like every single champ in the game. Because I think from now on, if you guys do want me to kind of do these videos again, I'll probably just like do this sort of stuff that's changed. But yeah, basically at the end of the video, let me know if it's helpful. As always, all the champions are timestamped below. Like I said, it's going to be a long video, so if you want to skip to a specific section, like a specific champion, that's absolutely fine. But let's get into the video. So let me first talk about like what I think makes a champion valuable. So for me, there's like a bunch of different things in solo queue that make a champion valuable, and no single champ in the whole game has all of them. But the more of them that you do have, like the more likely that champ is strong. And I'm not gonna like hard commit to like assigning each one like a rating out of 10, but I just want to give you guys some kind of idea. So the first thing is the laning strength. Like I think laning is a really big part of solo queue. It helps you snowball the early game. It can help you make the difference in bad matchups compared to good matchups. So I think if your champion is strong in lane, obviously it is quite important. Next thing, gank setup and CC. So this can allow you to help snowball the game. Also, if you have CC, you can bring some utility to your team, even if you're behind. So I think gank setup and CC is nice as well. Mobility is always very useful in solo queue. I think there's like mobility helps a lot because it means like you can play more aggressive at some times. It also means you might not get as punished sometimes. And also in solo queue, when you get like bounties and stuff, if you have mobility, it'll be a bit easier to play that out. So that's another thing that can be helpful. Matchups and blind pickability. This is like how the champion's matchups are compared to the other meta champs. Like if it has a lot of good matchups, it's likely to go up in kind of the tiers. Also, if it's a champion that deals well, kind of like being blind picked and deals well with like being countered, then it can be quite good as well. I think this is something that people don't think about as much because there are a lot of the champions that I think are quite strong that actually aren't very blind pickable, but I do have an S tier counter tier or section of the tier list down here, so I will put some champions in there where they're not that great as blind picks, but they're extremely good counter picks. Another thing is scaling. Now, I'd actually say before Season 12, scaling was not something I cared about pretty much at all in solo queue, but now with how like the game has been slowed down a lot, so without like the early scuttle crabs, without the early TPs, and also with the comeback gold bounties from objectives, scaling has been incentivized quite a bit. So again, if your champion has scaling, it's quite good, right? Another thing is roaming. So if your champion has like good wave clear or like good roaming potential, oftentimes you can snowball the game. Another thing that kind of goes with this is carry potential. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean just going 10 and 0. For example, a champ like Karma mid that's more supportive still has a lot of carry potential. It's basically about creating the difference, right? Like, so basically helping get your team over the line. There's lots of ways you can do that. It can be like through just like 1v9ing team fights. It can be through like supporting a team. It can be through roaming. There's lots of different ways. And then the last thing is like how hard it is to be punished. So champions with lots of mobility or champions with like very long range are often very forgiving, and you can make a lot of mistakes and still like get a lot of wins with them. So again, there's no champion that has all these things, and you shouldn't see like if a champion, for example, has strong lane strength and has no scaling, doesn't mean the champ is bad. There are plenty of champs with lane strength and scaling, and that might not mean they're good if they're missing the other things. So basically, it's kind of like an average between all these things. I'll explain each champ in detail. Again, you can just skip to the timestamps below, or there's like a full tier list at the end. So yeah, the more of these a champion has, the stronger they're going to be. Lastly, before I get to kind of explain the tiers, I feel like anything B and above is quite strong, and I think stuff other than that is sort of weak, obviously other than the S tier counters. I think if a champ is like B tier, it's still good, but like champs that are A and A plus and S are obviously stronger. Also, another thing that I want to say is that I think you can reach Challenger with any champion on this list, but it would also be like lying to you if I said that some champions weren't easier than others. So I think just like keep that in mind, and you should still probably play what's most fun for you. Like if a champ's just not fun, even though it's really OP, you'll probably quit the game, so don't do that. So first up on our list, we have Ahri. I think Ahri is probably the most OP mid laner in the game at the moment. She is for sure S tier. She is slated for some nerfs on the next patch, so we'll see how that affects her, but I think at the moment, she just has too much of everything. She's got CC, she's very hard to punish, like with her mobility and her sustain. I think she's extremely blind pickable, probably the most blind pickable at the moment. She just offers way too much, and I think everyone sort of knows at the moment that Ahri is really, really OP. Definitely the best champ to abuse at the moment because she's not even that hard to play, and she just like brings so much. So yeah, I think Ahri definitely S tier. Next, we have Akali. In my opinion, Akali is an A tier mid laner. I think that she carries games really well. She has mobility, sort of hard to punish, and she does like take quite a bit of skill. I think the only thing that really holds Akali back is she has some difficulties with some of the meta matchups. So champions like Ahri and Vex, I feel like are pretty good into Akali. I also feel like just in general, she's a bit less blind pickable, but she's a really good counter pick, and it's not like she's a bad blind pick. So I think Akali's really good in solo queue. Definitely an A tier pick, just not quite as OP maybe as some of the champs that are up here. Next one is Anivia. I also think Anivia is an A tier mid laner. This might surprise you guys because I've seen on some other tier lists recently, like on Coach Curtis's tier list, actually has Anivia very low, but I disagree for a lot of reasons. I think in Season 12, it has made Anivia a lot better, and one reason for that is Anivia has the tools to stall the game for a really, really long time. Like with her wave clear, she can make sure the game doesn't end for pretty much ever. And during that time, it allows you to scale into the game, like you and your team. It gives you chances to come back. And in Season 12, like comeback mechanics and scaling in general are much more valuable than they were in past seasons. Another thing is, Anivia always had a very strong 1v1 laning phase. The problem was that her skirmishing early game was so weak. Now that like Scuttle Crab and early game skirmishes aren't as big a thing as before, I think a significant amount of Anivia's kind of like weak skirmishing early game is kind of like nullified and not something you need to worry about now. So I think Anivia is pretty hard to play, and she definitely has a more unique play style. But I think if you play well on her, she's quite strong, and I definitely think she's an A tier mid lane. Next up is Annie. I think Annie also is an A tier mid laner. I think this is one that probably gets a bit worse at high elo, but it's still quite good. I think Annie is like very easy to play, punishes a lot of champions, and even some of the champions that counter Annie, if they do make mistakes, you can punish them really hard. I will say that Annie is a bit lower in A tier than some of these other champs, and I will try order them. But I think she does suffer kind of from, she has some difficult matchups. She also is like fairly immobile, but she can like carry and pressure the game quite a lot. So I do like Annie, but I think she should definitely be in the lower part of A tier, but she's still a solid choice overall. Next is Aurelion Sol. I think Aurelion Sol is probably B tier. I think Aurelion Sol, when he's OP, is probably an S tier champion. There's a lot of things about Aurelion Sol that are really good, like he can pressure the map like probably more than any other champ through roaming when he's OP. I think right now he doesn't really have it's just like not quite tuned properly. I think his numbers are just sort of weak. I think he's getting some sort of like update or rework soon, so likely he'll be better at that point. I think right now, Aurelion Sol requires like a lot of investment to get good at and doesn't have that many transferable skills, so I don't rate him that highly in terms of improving either. And I don't think that the effort you put into him is really rewarded at the moment. I would say he's kind of in that like mid-B tier of like, yeah, he's a good champion, but there's certainly much better champions and much easier champions as well. Azir is another one that would go in the B tier. I'd say he's actually quite a high B. I think Azir in solo queue has always been kind of not very good, and the reason for that is again like early skirmishing was a big thing and scaling was kind of weak. In Season 12, I think Azir became a lot better, and you see his win rate is much higher than before despite being like a very difficult champion. So I think Azir's always had very strong 1v1 laning, similar to Anivia, but has kind of struggled with like actual skirmishing. But in this season, like you kind of get like that free early game, you don't have to fight scuttles, and you scale really well. So yeah, I think he's like a high B tier. You can definitely carry games on him. Again, he is really difficult, so there are like certainly easier champs that you could play. But he's not a bad choice. I think these champions are still strong, but they're just not quite as strong as the ones above them. Next, we actually have Ashe. So I think Ashe is a pretty decent mid laner. I've played against this a few times recently, and I think like the full CDR build is actually pretty good. Like you can just like Ashe out over and over. This is not a champion that you can blind pick, I don't think, but a lot of the time you pick Ashe, people won't know you're playing at mid. I'm only going to talk about this a little bit because I've actually never played Ashe, mid that is, but from playing against it mid, it actually seems pretty strong. That you have ult on like a super short cooldown with like Ultimate Hunter and CDR boots. So I think it's actually decent, probably in the lower B tier because it's not blind pickable, I wouldn't say, but it's something you could experiment if you're looking for something a bit more off meta and a bit cheesier. A Brand, in my opinion, C tier mid laner. I don't think Brand has much going for him other than damage. He's very immobile. He doesn't have like that great a lane phase. He struggles with a lot of matchups, especially assassin matchups. So I don't see much reason to pick Brand, and I'd say the C tier is definitely where I consider these champs to be weaker, and like you can still get high rank with them, but it's like you are putting yourself at a disadvantage, I would say. So I'm not really a fan of Brand. I think Brand is much better as an AD carry or support because the matchups bot lane are a lot easier. But again, like I don't play Brand personally. This is just my experience from playing against them. Next on our list, we have Cassio as an A+ mid laner. I say she wouldn't be like near the very top of A+, but she's very good against a lot of the meta right now, against a lot of these short range champions. She does kind of struggle against the more traditional mages like your Syndra's, Orianna's, Xerath, stuff like that. But you don't see that super often in solo queue at the moment. I think she is generally better as a counter pick, but she's a fairly decent blind as well. I think Cassio's itemization at the moment is quite good too. I guess Cassio's like biggest weakness is probably her lack of mobility, but at the moment you can build so tanky on Cassio with like overgrowth conditioning, and then like the 3 HP items like Everfrost, Rylai's, and Seraph's. So you can get really, really tanky and kind of negate a lot of that, and I think she carries games extremely well. She's one of those champions that has like early game skirmishing, she has CC, she snowballs her lane very well. So like she's just really strong pretty much at all stages of the game, scales really well, good side laning. There's a ton of really good things about Cassio. I am a little bit biased obviously because I've been a Cassio main for a long time, but I do think she is really strong, and your main weakness that you're really going to run into is maybe some of the more difficult matchups if you're blind picking her, or some comps that either heavily outrange you or have some really good dives. So stuff like Jarvan, before you get the tools like Zhonya's and stuff to deal with it, those can be quite difficult. But overall, I think she's like a really, really good pick at the moment. Next is Cho'Gath. I'm actually going to put Cho'Gath in the S tier counter column. I think Cho'Gath is a pretty good mid, counter to stuff that's extremely immobile, or also a counter against some of the assassins that really need to kill you. There's a couple builds you can do on Cho. You can do like a tankier build if you're against maybe an assassin. You can also just do a full AP build if you're against something immobile. And that actually works really well. It isn't something I would blind pick because I think there are a lot of champions that could just like farm you with first strike and you couldn't really do much against them. So more of the range champions, like I could think of like Xerath and Victor being quite difficult. But I think he's like actually a pretty good counter pick, so it's definitely something you could consider. I don't think he's like super hard to play. But yeah, overall he's got some good things going for him, and I think if you pick him in the right situation, he's really, really strong. Now we have Corki. Unfortunately, Corki does go in the D tier. I think Corki, after the nerfs, it's not so much that he's actually just like a terrible champion now. It's more that just like Corki is so similar to the other poking champions that typically just whichever poking champion is best is the one that gets picked. I think Corki is like, he's always been not that great in solo queue, but when he got like super overtuned, he was pretty good. But I think now, not only has he's been brought down to kind of that level, but he's not a great solo queue champ overall. And there are much better poke champions that you could play, so we'll talk about some of those later, but like Lux, for an example, I think has a lot higher impact, much better matchups, and is also, I'd say, a little bit easier to play than Corki. So yeah, I don't think there's too much point to pick Corki anymore, but if you really, really enjoy him, like, you could still make it work. It's just going to be putting yourself at a bit of a disadvantage. Diana mid doesn't get played very much because she's probably more of a jungler, to be honest, and she's a much better jungler than she is a mid laner. That being said, Diana mid is decent. I don't see any reason really to play Diana over one of the other AP assassins. Champs like Akali and Sylas, I think, are kind of just better than Diana. But Diana mid isn't awful, and the one kind of like nice thing about her is that if you pick Diana, a lot of people will just be thinking it's jungle. So I used to play a lot of Diana in Season 10. Actually, when I got rank 1 in that season, I was playing a lot of Diana mid at the time. So I kind of have a little bit of a soft spot for her, but I think at the moment she doesn't have like the best itemization, and she also struggles with some of these meta matchups like Ahri and Vex. So I don't really think she's that strong at the moment. She is just like a decent pick overall. Now, Ekko, I would say Ekko is on the lower side of A tier. I think Ekko is quite good as a counter pick, but again, he sort of suffers against some of these like meta picks, like the Ahris and the Vexes. He has a very hard time against champs like this. But I think like in terms of like a counter pick, in terms of what Ekko actually brings to the champion, he's quite good. He has the ability to farm, like he can carry, he's like good at skirmishing. So there's a lot of good things about Ekko, and really the main problem for him is like the laning phase for him is quite weak, and he doesn't have like guaranteed CC. And again, a lot of these matchups are going to be hard. So in my opinion, Ekko is like a low A or a high B. He's still pretty good, but there are much better AP champs that you could pick if you wanted to play like an AP melee. But like overall, like he's still A tier, right? He's still quite strong. Fiora, I would say, is another S tier counter pick. There's going to be very few people out there that can play Fiora because like you guys are mostly going to be mid laners. But if you're a top laner and you happen to main Fiora, maybe you queue mid secondary, there's actually a lot of times where against melee champions, Fiora is quite good mid. The like nice things about mid is like maybe you don't have to take TP, or you could take something like TP Ghost rather than Flash or TP Ignite. So there's like a lot of things you can do with the sums there, and Fiora is super, super good against some of these AD mids, but definitely not a blind pick, and you will struggle against a lot of the mages. So I wouldn't really recommend putting time into this if you are a mid laner already. It'll more be like if you off-roll top and you play Fiora there, or you main top and you off-roll mid. I think Fiora mid as a counter could be quite good. Fizz. Fizz is definitely a very high A+ mid. I think Fizz has always been like a premier solo queue pick. He's so good at taking over games, and to be honest, even though some of his matchups are difficult, he has the tools like with gank setup, with roams to kind of ignore a lot of that. So I think Fizz is like a really, really strong pick in solo queue, and I think he often goes under the radar because Fizz in competitive has always not been that good. But at the moment, I think Fizz, well, to be honest, for a pretty long time, Fizz has been very, very strong in solo queue, and definitely one of the like AP melees that I would really recommend picking up, because I think he's just like an elo printer pretty much. So I really like Fizz, and actually Fizz is my permaban in solo queue, so I just said I like Fizz, but I really hate playing against Fizz, but I think he's really strong. So yeah, I definitely recommend putting some time into him. He's got a lot of stuff going for him. Gank setup, mobility, I think he has like good blind pick ability. He takes over games, good side laning. There's just like a ton of really good things about Fizz. Probably the most annoying thing for Fizz, I would say, would be certain comps can deal with him well, and also like in kind of that like mid-game period where some people start getting zonies and defensive items, if you didn't get ahead enough by this point, you don't really offer anything to your team other than damage. But I think you're pretty reliably able to get to that point where you do have the damage, like you have the tools to do so. But yeah, overall, A+ pick. Galio. I think Galio is one of the premier roaming champs at the moment. I wouldn't quite put him in S tier, but I'd say he's like more of a mid A+ tier champion. Galio has always been very good at like carrying games, kind of just like through roaming and stuff like that. And I think he's one of the few champs that can kind of snowball the game enough at the moment to like outpace scaling. And to be honest, Galio doesn't have poor scaling anyway. He's like pretty good at all stages of the game. I think also the current meta, Galio has a pretty decent time against some of the stronger champions and is good against like the a lot of the assassins as well. So I think Galio with the Predator build has a lot of things going for him, and I think he's probably the best roaming, like pure roaming champion. I'm thinking in terms of like Twisted Fate, Aurelion Sol, Galio, those sort of champs. I think he's probably the best at it at the moment. When the Taliyah changes come through, it might be that Taliyah kind of takes Galio's place as like the premier roaming champion. But right now, Galio definitely kind of has that throne. A Gragas mid, I would say Gragas mid is sort of decent. I'd maybe give him a high B or a low A. Not really sure where between those. I guess I'll give him a high B for now. I think he has like a lot of CC and he can deal well with a lot of the mid lane matchups. The thing with Gragas is I think Vex sort of does what Gragas does better, like in terms of being like a counter to melees and having a lot of CC. So I guess mainly that's why Gragas gets marked down. He's not really like a bad champion. He actually is fairly blind pickable and does have some like really good counter matchups. But I think just like Ahri and Vex, the current meta, kind of do what Gragas does better. So I sort of think he's just like outshone by those champs. Graves, I think Graves is another B tier champion. He used to be kind of good, but now I think he's just like not the greatest. He does have against some good matchups. He has some bad matchups, like mages normally are quite difficult because they have range, and also like the armor doesn't do much. And then there's like, yeah, there's some melees that you could do stuff against, but I think he's just like not really the best at the moment. He can like spam push and look to like kind of invade the enemy junglers, so you can do that, but I think there are much better champs to do this. And also he's very punishable, he's short range, he doesn't have CC and stuff like that. So I think Graves is missing some of those things that really take him to being a much stronger pick, and I think Graves is much better in top lane than mid lane. But he is decent. Now, Heimer, I would say, is probably a very low B or possibly even a C. I feel like Heimer doesn't really bring that much, although he is a very annoying champion to verse. And actually, in the current meta, when there's a lot of stuff that's short range, you can sort of deal with them quite well. But I think there are just, again, like champs that can do what Heimer does better. Another kind of good thing about Heimer is that if you're a Heimer one trick, you can play Heimer in a lot of roles. Like I think you can play Heimer mid, Heimer top, Heimer bot, maybe even Heimer support. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with that, and if you're very, very proficient on Heimer, I can see you climbing quite high, but he does like take a lot of skill, and I think he is quite punishable if you make mistakes. So he definitely has some potential, but not as strong as some of the other champs on this list. Now, Taliyah at the moment, I would say, would be about a mid-tier B champion, somewhere around here. I think she is good. I'm not going to go too in-depth into this because I think Taliyah is getting reworked on the very next patch, and the changes look very promising. So I'm imagining that Taliyah is probably going to shoot up to like at least A, but I'm thinking A+, or maybe even S. So we'll see how these changes pan out, but I think, yeah, Taliyah is going to be quite strong, and at the moment, she's just sort of decent. Aurelia is definitely an A+ tier champion. She has tons of stuff going for her. I think the real biggest problem of Aurelia is how hard she is to play. In my opinion, Aurelia has the highest skill ceiling of probably any champion in the game, and also you're punished extremely hard for making mistakes. But she has very good mid matchups into pretty much anything, and also if you're picking her, a lot of people will think you're going top. So you'll get better matchups because of that. She has pretty good itemization. Definitely carries games, farms well. The real, like, I guess thing stopping her from being absolute S tier is, again, some of the meta matchups are a little difficult for her. I think like Ahri and Vex deal quite well with her in team fights, and that is something that holds her back a little, and also her difficulty. But I think Aurelia overall is a champion that scales more with skill than anything else. You know, other champions scale with gold, scale with XP and stuff, but Aurelia just purely scales with skill. The better you are at Aurelia, kind of like the better it's going to go for you. I'd potentially even say that if you're just Aurelia one trick and you're really, really good at her, that she'd be an S tier champion. Not quite as good as some of the other S tier champions, but I could see an argument for it. Yeah, very, very strong champion. Ivern, I think you can make an argument that Ivern is an S tier counter, and I'm not sure if it's so much as a counter, but more just like compositionally. Ivern at the moment does very, very well with Rengar, and also I think Ivern is very good against comps where they have a lot of bursts, they really need to burst someone down. And then doesn't do so well against the champs that really want extended fights. But I think Ivern is pretty decent. Again, this is a champion that I don't really play. But from what I've seen of Ivern, he seems like he's very strong as a counterpick in the right situations. But definitely not a champ that I would consider just like picking all the time, as I think you'd run into quite a lot of issues, particularly with like the more meta mage matchups. Next is Jayce. I don't think Jayce is that good. I think he's like very similar to Graves, where he's just like a somewhat mediocre mid lane AD pick, and I think there are much better AD picks. If you're very good at Jayce, possibly it could possibly move to A tier, because I think he like does have a lot of potential to kind of snowball the game. Again, like a lot of the mages are quite good against Jayce, although you can bully a lot of these mages. You do have to be quite careful of ganks and stuff like that, but you do have the tools to snowball the game. So I don't mind Jayce. I think he's good, but I think your time is better invested somewhere else. Again, this could be a situation where if you play Jayce already, you play Jayce top for some reason, like that's your main or something like that, you could definitely play Jayce mid, and it'd probably be decent, potentially like a high B or a low A. I think for the average person, Jayce is not going to be that strong and not that worth investing time into, or at least that's just my opinion on it. I haven't played Jayce in a couple seasons now. So yeah, I kind of prefer like maybe a champ like Lucian or Akshan instead of Jayce, but we'll get to those a bit later. Kai'Sa, I'd say, is somewhat similar to Corki, and that she's been nerfed pretty significantly and isn't as strong as before. I think she's not so bad to be put in D tier, but I think again there's not much reason to pick her over something like Ziggs or Lux. Xerath, you know, these better poking champions. So in my opinion, not much point picking her anymore, but like again, if it's like if you main AD maybe and you want an AD champ to play mid, you could try play Kai'Sa. Kalista, I would say, is C tier, although Kalista could be put higher. I think there's a lot of things about Kalista mid that are actually pretty good, but to be honest, she's just like really difficult and really punishing, and I think if you do want to play this playstyle, you would be better off playing like Lucian or Akshan. But if you're a Kalista one trick, I think she can definitely work mid. And if you are a Kalista one trick, I'd say she's maybe like a B+ or something. But again, for the most part, I don't think you want to put time into learning Kalista. It'd be much better to be learning a different champion. Rather than kind of like playing, I guess, like an inferior option of the AD bully mid. Now, Karma. This is going to surprise a lot of people, but I think Karma is A+, and I think she's like really, really good. So the thing with Karma is that she's very blind pickable because, one, like she's a flex pick, she can be played in multiple lanes, but also in most of her matchups, she gets pushed, like she just spam pushes the wave, and she will always get you a lot of value. It's very easy to just like press RE or RQ in team fights and create a ton of value for your team. She has early skirmishing. I guess this is one of those champions where the carry potential comes from just like constantly buffing your team and making sure your team never like gives over kills, which makes objectives and stuff a lot easier. I guess maybe the biggest downfall of Karma is her lack of mobility, but she is a little bit tankier than your average mage, and I think if you play well, you can kind of deal with this, but there are some comps that could be quite difficult for you. Overall, I think Karma is an excellent champ to pick up, probably the best supportive mid at the moment, at least that I can think of, and I think she's just very easy to kind of just like plug and play and just have really, really high impact every game. It would be better if you can sync her with like one of the carry junglers, so like a Hecarim, Kindred, those Graves, those sorts of champions where you kind of enable them. It can even be melee bruisers like Wukongs and stuff like that. And I'd say Karma isn't that great with a champion like, say, Karthus, although there is an argument that like Karma's wave clear kind of keeps Karthus safe, and then like Karthus brings the AP damage, so there are probably worse combinations, but I think, yeah, Karma overall going to be pretty good almost every game. Kassadin, I think, is an S tier counter pick. I think Kassadin is probably the most versatile counter pick. Like, okay, you're mainly going to be picking Kassadin against AP champs, particularly ones that are weaker in early game. But this is a champ that you can counter pick with in a lot of games. You know, like other counter picks, say like some of the other ones here, they're a bit more niche, and even if you can play them, you might not get to use them that often. Whereas like if you're a good Kassadin and you're looking for counter picks with them, I could see like you could. If you're counter picking rather than blind picking, you could pick him almost every time. And to be honest, Kassadin's a pretty good just general pick. I'd say he'd probably be like in high A or a low A plus in terms of solo queue, because he has a lot of snowballing, high, like really high carry potential, good side laning. You know, there's a lot of stuff going for him. I guess like Kassadin's biggest weakness would be that early skirmishing, but that's not as big a problem anymore. And again, like some of his blind pick ability is a little bad. Against some of these AD champions, sometimes you can have kind of your agency over the game, like in terms of being able to control what happens, kind of fully taken away from you. But if you pick him in the right spot, absolutely S tier, and pretty good even if not. Karthus, I think, is another A plus tier champion. I think he's really, really good. He can farm fast, have lots of impact, wins a lot of his lanes. I guess the main problems about Karthus, I think some of his matchups are quite difficult. And I also feel like he is quite hard to play, and he's a very unique champion. So this is the kind of champion that I think if you kind of like really put a lot of effort into, it can be very, very rewarding, very strong, and always has like a really high impact on the map, just because you're going to be like ulting people. It can affect the side lanes, and it guarantees like team fight wins basically. So I really like Karthus. He is like a high, what's it called? Like a high investment champion. And I think it's more likely that if you play Karthus, you're just a Karthus one trick. You play like Karthus mid, jungle, AD or something like that. But yeah, definitely worth thinking about as a champion. Katarina, I would also say is A+, and maybe even S. I feel like if you're in one of the faster paced regions, like I think like Korea, for example, whenever I've played in Korea has been very, very fast paced. Same with like China solo queue. So I think if you're in one of these regions, Katarina is probably an S tier pick. And to be honest, she's probably a bit higher in A+ tier. I'll say like maybe about here. I think she's really, really strong. She has like very good itemization at the moment. Again, it's like she's a very unique champion, I think, in how she plays compared to some of the other assassins. She's like very mechanical and will test a lot of those skills. I think she's quite good. Katarina's probably biggest downfall, again, is some of these meta matchups are quite hard. I think like Ahri and Vex, I keep coming back to these, and the reason is they kind of dictate a lot of the meta right now with just how strong they are. These matchups are very difficult for Katarina. I also think that Kassadin is a very, very good counter to Katarina unless she can like cheese a kill in the first couple levels. So yeah, I think you can pick Katarina blind pick pretty much all the time, and like most of the time you'll be fine, especially if you ban like Kassadin or Vex, like whichever one you see more. It's a very good like elo printing solo queue champion. Arguable if it'll make you a better player or not, but certainly good for just like getting some wins. Kayle, I think, is on sort of like somewhere around the mid tier of B champions. She is a scaling champion, but I don't think she offers as much as other scaling champions, and she is quite weak in the early game. Although at level 6 or so, you can start like farming really quick and punishing your opponent. To be honest, the best thing about Kayle, I would say, is when you pair her with some of these junglers like a Kindred or a Hecarim, her ult gets insane value. So I'd say that like normally Kayle is probably like a very just like mid B tier. She's just like an average champion maybe. But if you compare her with a jungler that really uses your ult well, I could see her being kind of like a low to mid A tier champion. So it's not a bad champion by any means. It's just I think most of the time there are better options. But in some situations you can get a lot of value. Although I think there is an argument maybe that if you're playing Kayle with those champs like Hecarim and stuff, you would maybe prefer to play Armor. Although Kayle is like a pretty good option as well and does bring a bit more damage and side lane potential. Another one you guys might not see coming, I would say, is actually Kennen. I think Kennen is a pretty good mid laner. He is very good against like short range mages, ones that are more immobile, and also against any champion that is gonna like dash on you. So like even some of the mages like LeBlanc and stuff, and some of the mages have to come forward, like Zoe for example. You can easily one-shot a level 6. Obviously Kennen deals quite well with melees as well. He has like good side laning, really good team fighting, and I think another thing about Kennen is that a lot of people just like won't expect him to be mid, so I think it's a very annoying champ to deal with. And another thing that's underrated is that if people don't realize it's Kennen mid and they don't take cleanse, it's like a really big deal. If they take cleanse, you're kind of soft countered, and it does make the game quite a bit more difficult for you, but a lot of the time they won't, and that's going to be really, really good for you. I think, yeah, Kennen definitely worth trying. I think if you play against champs like maybe like Syndra, Orianna, and some of the longer range mages. Like Lux and stuff, playing Kennen could be quite hard, but against like the more meta picks, I think Kennen's actually pretty good. LeBlanc, I would say, is another A tier or A plus pick. I think she's really, really good, and LeBlanc has been kind of like my go-to pick like pretty much all of last season. The only reason I think LeBlanc has fallen off a little bit this season is I think, again, that current meta of like Ahri, Vex, and also having Kassadin as a counter is very, very annoying for LeBlanc to deal with. I think another thing is that because the scaling meta is a bit more incentivized, I think more than last season, you see these champs like Lulu and Sona bot. They're not super common, but I think while you can kill them if they miss position, if they play team fights well, it can be very hard to like make sure you 100-0 the AD carry. That's made LeBlanc's life a little bit more difficult, but does have a ton of things going for her, like really good mobility, ganks it up, snowballing. Like there's so many good things about LeBlanc. It's just you really have to be careful about some of these more difficult matchups. But if you can like say ban one of them and then like try avoid the others either by counter picking or just by blind picking, and maybe you just like decide you're going to play well, like deal with these matchups and hopefully you won't encounter them that often. So LeBlanc, big time investment champion, but definitely pays off. Lissandra, I would say, is somewhere like a very high B or a low A. I'm kind of tempted to give her a low A. I feel like Lissandra is just a super impactful champion pretty much no matter what. She brings tons of CC, and I think the electrocute build has a lot of damage. And I think her matchups at the moment are pretty much fine. So I think Lissandra, again, like a lot of things going for her, but something that kind of bites Lissandra is that Ahri and Vex sort of do her job better, so I don't see that much reason to pick Lissandra over them at the moment. But in her own right, she is a pretty good champion. So if she's a champion and like a playstyle that you enjoy, I think she's definitely worth putting a little bit of time into. Lucian's a difficult one. I'd say he's either a very high A or a low A+. I'm probably going to put him as a high A for now. The thing is, the new Lucian build that's been going around, I think, is quite strong. So this is like either Eclipse, you can go like Eclipse Collector Sorella, or you can go Gale Force Collector Sorella. This makes playing the game a lot easier because you're less reliant on your short range autos, and you're much more of a spellcaster. And I think also having the lethality helps you snowball and clear waves a bit earlier in the game. So I really like Lucian. The only thing with Lucian is, again, like he is very punishing. If you make mistakes, you will fall behind and be useless. Also, some compositions can be very difficult for him if he fakes a lot of CC. Champions like Wukongs and Malphites can be very difficult for you to play. But I think kind of similar to Irelia, Lucian is one of those champs that really scales with your skill. If you're very, very good at Lucian, you have like probably pretty good results with him. But there are definitely easier champs to play. But if it's something you enjoy, I think he is probably the strongest like AD ranged bully at the moment. And definitely like one of the most fun mid laners in my opinion, and worth giving a go. Lulu mid, I think, is probably somewhere in the middle of B tier. To be honest, Lulu is very similar to Karma, but she just offers like a little bit less. Like she has a stronger lane in terms of punishing assassins, which is one thing she has going for her. I think it's so much easier to create consistent value with Karma, and I would prefer to have her most of the time. So I'm not really a huge fan of Lulu at the moment, although she is a champ you could consider. I really think Karma just does her job better. Yeah, the main thing I guess that's good about Lulu is she does have a very strong lane into some of these assassins and can like singularly counter them quite hard. So I do like that. If you see a composition where maybe they have like only one threat, or you just have a comp where you're all building around one person, then in that sort of situation, Lulu could be quite good. But I just think there are better options than Lulu for what she brings to the table. Now, Lux is actually another A+ tier mid laner. This is one that really goes under the radar. I think Lux is super, super good. The Lux has the ability to create like a lot of pressure without like endangering herself at all. She actually has a pretty strong lane phase, although she kind of does struggle against some of the assassins. And one nice thing about Lux is that she can actually like kind of affect the map without really compromising her lane. So she can just like walk down the river and then like ult bot or ult top without really having to fully commit to it. So I really like Lux. I think she's pretty blind pickable. There's a lot of those assassin matchups that you can survive by having like barrier or exhaust or something. And I think she's very similar to Ahri, and that she's a champ that's like quite difficult to punish while also being a champ that's very easy. So I think, yes, she's like definitely an elo inflated champion and worth abusing if you kind of like the more long range playstyle. Yeah, good champ overall. Malphite, no surprise, another S tier counter pick. This can be really, really good against AD mid. So if you're against champions like Zed, Kiana, Talon, you can pick Malphite and go like either one tank item full AP, or you can go full tank, or you can just go full AP. There's a lot of things you can do with Malphite. If you ever end up against a full AD team, you can definitely destroy them. I think also Malphite is one of these ones down here that actually doesn't take a huge time investment into kind of like learning, I guess, like maybe Cho'Gath's the same. You can kind of like pick up and play these champions, not to their full potential by any means, but they're a bit easier to learn than some of the other ones down there. So I really like Malphite mid, and I think if you find you struggle with like versing 80 champions or having like a counter pick to those champions, it could definitely be an option for you. Malzahar, I would give a pretty high B, potentially a low A. I think it's like very easy to have a lot of impact on Malzahar in teamfights. One thing that used to be quite difficult for Malzahar was playing the early game in solo queue because your skirmishing was so weak. As we said before, the skirmishing is not as big an issue anymore. So mainly like those early fights, like the scuttle, it's not going to be a thing anymore. I will say Malzahar's probably biggest drawback is that a lot of his matchups are very, very difficult. Sometimes you make up for it just by scaling so incredibly hard. Like Malzahar's scaling, just in terms of damage output, is probably one of the highest. But yeah, a lot of these matchups are very, very difficult for Malzahar, and it can kind of make you lose agency over the game. So I think I'd prefer Malzahar kind of as a counter pick champion. But you could experiment with blind picking him. I think there's some matchups where you could probably just AFK wave clear your tower, but again, like you're giving up control of this early game for a really, really long time. So yeah, I think he's a pretty decent, like good champion, but they're a better one. Mordekaiser, this one I actually also feel like is an S tier counter pick. I think there's a lot of melees that can't really fight you. And there's some like sort of a mobile short range mages that also have difficulty versus you. I think again, this is one of those champs where you don't really want to invest a ton of time into him if you don't play him already. If you play mid and top, you could like flex Malzahar flex Mordekaiser between these roles. But I wouldn't really recommend going out of your way just to learn Mordekaiser for mid. But yeah, it's like if you enjoy the champion, you could consider playing him mid as well. He has some niche situations where he's really, really strong. Morgana, another pretty like sort of meh tier champion. I think there's a lot of other champions that provide more CC and have better matchups than Morgana. If you did want to play Morgana, I think you're probably looking to play her against stuff that really suffers from like being pushed in. So champs where you can just like spam wave clear them in. Also champions like Zoe or LeBlanc where their CC is quite important and you can use your Black Shield to kind of disrupt that. I do think there are better answers to these champions, but Morgana in those situations could be considered maybe B tier, like just a good champion, but not great. Neeko, I would say, is a very high A or potentially an A+. I'm probably going to put her about here. I think Neeko is really, really strong and just like one of those champs that's really underplayed. So she has like a really good build path at the moment. She's very strong in lane and she deals well with most of the meta picks. Probably the most difficult matchups for Neeko are those longer range mages again, so stuff like Syndra, Lux, Xerath. These can be quite hard for Neeko, but against like pretty much anything shorter range than that, you can pretty much always bully your lane. And to be honest, Neeko is just a very misunderstood champion. I really like Neeko. I played her a lot back in I think season 10 or 11. I can't remember which season it was. Basically, when she was quite a strong mid laner, I did play her quite a bit in solo queue because she can really take over games and she has like a lot of 1v9 potential. But definitely another champion where you've got to put in like a lot of time investment before she kind of like becomes relevant. It's also nice that she has quite a few builds, so you can kind of like build according to how the game's going, or just like what kind of comp you're against or what you need. So she's very versatile, and I really like Neeko, and probably one of the most underrated champs in the game, I would say. Now, Nunu is one that I see get played mid a lot, and I'm actually not too sure where to put him. I feel like he's more of like maybe a low A tier or high B tier champion. The thing is, I see like every Nunu plays so differently to how the game is generally played. Like it's very much a push and roam champion, and it's like pretty much only one tricks that play him, and I have never played Nunu mid, so I don't feel like I have a great read on this. I think in general, roaming champions typically tend to be on the stronger side in solo queue. So if you think you can play Nunu and you know the skills, he could probably be A or maybe even A+. But I don't really feel confident rating him, to be honest. This is probably one of the champs on this list that I feel the least knowledgeable about. So yeah, take my opinion on Nunu with a grain of salt. I think he could be stronger than this. He could even be weaker than this. I would honestly probably check somewhere else. I just wanted to include like pretty much every champ I could think of that I've played against in mid somewhat recently. This tier list is taking so long, you might notice it's now nighttime and I've changed shirts, so funny how that works. But let's keep going. So Orianna, I think, is a pretty high B tier champion. I think Orianna in the past has always been like a really good champ for learning and like improving, but hasn't ever been like a solo queue terror. I think in season 12, like with the kind of like the more focus on like 1v1 mid lane, because like there's skirmishes early, and also like scaling being rewarded quite a bit more, I think makes Orianna a pretty strong pick. I think she's potentially even a low A. The reason I kind of put her in B tier is she does lack a lot of things. Like she doesn't have great gank setup or CC. She doesn't have lots of mobility and stuff like that. So she definitely has some problems, but I think Orianna is pretty good at the moment. I'd say another thing maybe that holds Orianna back a little bit is her itemization isn't as strong as it was in past seasons. I remember season 10, I think, or season 11, I think it was season 10, when the Seraph shield was really strong, Orianna was like an absolute demon with that. So I think her itemization is decent, but not as good as some of the like more pen-focused mages. But yeah, still pretty strong champ overall, and definitely more than just a champ that's used for learning right now. She is very blind pickable and kind of like a strong staple in every champ pool, so I do like her quite a bit. Now, Pantheon. Pantheon is, honestly, it's not super good, like on its own, but the thing is that like Pantheon is really good because he enables like a lot of the AP champs. So for example, like Pantheon paired with like Taliyah jungle, for example, Pantheon paired with Ekko, Pantheon paired with Evelyn. There's like a lot of AP junglers that Pantheon enables, but the problem is if you play Pantheon without him, he's just not super strong. I think if you pair Pantheon with a AP jungler, he's potentially considered an A tier champion, but I think like just if you're just playing him every game, I don't think he's that strong. I think he's again just like sort of average. Like there's some matchups you struggle with. Again, against melee matchups, you actually do very well. Again, against melee matchups, maybe I'd like put him more of an A tier, but I think he's just like a bit too situational of a pick to have him like be just like a strong champion. But he has his use cases. He's definitely not a bad champion by any means, and he is useful to have in your champ pool. But there are just like better picks overall. Poppy, I would probably say, is an S tier counter. I think there's not that many champs that you can pick her into, so I almost don't feel like she's worth learning. But against like Irelia, Yasuo, Yon, like there's a lot of good matchups mid where Poppy can do really well, and also a lot of like combinations. Zoe, why did I say Zoe? That Poppy can do well into, just like lots of dash heavy team comps, and also she got some buffs recently, so I think she's pretty good. But again, she's just like never a champion that you're going to use more than like, you know, every like 20 games or something. So I don't think it's super good putting time into her, but if she's a champion you can already play, then you can consider her. Like definitely an A tier champion, but he's definitely a bit more unique. I'd maybe put him somewhere around here. I feel like if you're a Pyke one trick, he could maybe be quite a bit higher, but his playstyle is very unique. I don't think he's great for learning the game. He doesn't have any really transferable skills, and it's like, again, like a very, very unique playstyle, but he is very good. I'm honestly tempted to put him a bit higher, but this isn't a champion that I play. So yeah, maybe he could be higher up on the list, but I just don't really know enough about this. There also aren't many Pyke one tricks on my server. There's maybe only a couple in high alert, so it's not a champion that I encounter all the time. So yeah, I think very strong champion. Perhaps I'm underrating him a bit here. I just don't really know enough about him to give like a more detailed kind of analysis on him. Qiyana, I think also probably somewhere in the A tier. I think there are better assassins in the game than Qiyana, although Qiyana is quite good. I also think that Qiyana is a champ where if you're really, really good at Qiyana, you can make a lot of the matchups that are normally quite bad workable. So I think Qiyana's actually potentially a little bit higher. I'd maybe move her along to like here or something. I think she is like really good, but she is just a little outshone by some of the other AD assassins, but she is really, really good. Like, don't get me wrong, I really like Qiyana. Probably one of the most fun mid lane assassins as well. I guess like the kind of things you need to be careful of is there are some matchups that are very difficult for Qiyana, so maybe she's not a champ that you'd want to blind pick every game, although sometimes when you're picking Qiyana, people might think it's jungle, so you might be able to get away with this a bit. But yeah, I think Qiyana more of a counter pick champion, but very strong if you can get a good matchup, basically. Quinn, I'd probably say Quinn is somewhere around here. I feel like she's pretty good at mid lane. The reason she's not higher is because she has like the playstyle of say like Lucian or Akshan, but she just isn't quite as good at them, but as good as them, sorry. But she has like some pretty good matchups mid. Also being in mid allows you to kind of access everywhere. You can get a lot of control around mid, you can get deep wards and stuff like that. So I do like Quinn, but I think again, she's just sort of outshone by other picks. but certainly not bad and definitely an above average champion. Rumble, I think, is sort of pretty mid tier. I feel like he's been nerfed a lot, and he's just like not as strong as he used to be. He used to be a real terror. I think now he's probably just like a counterpick to melee champions, and there are like plenty of champions that do his job better. Like if you want to just deal with melee champions, I feel like Vex is definitely the premier. So I don't see any reason really to pick Rumble at the moment, but he is again like a decent champion, definitely viable. But just doesn't really have the real strength to him anymore that he used to, and just makes him kind of just like not super worth picking. Ryze, unfortunately, goes down to the D tier. I feel like Ryze isn't actually quite this bad. Like, okay, you can still get challenger with Ryze, right? I want you guys to realize that, like down here, you can still get challenger with these champions, but the problem is you're making it just really difficult for yourself. Like, Ryze is not very forgiving. He's very short range. He kind of needs to snowball. He tests like your farming fundamentals like to the limit, team fighting and side laning. Like it's just a very, very hard champion and really not worth playing. Like there are just so many easier picks that do what he does better. So I don't really want you to pick Ryze. But if you are going to pick Ryze, I don't think he's like god awful. And I think, yeah, like you can definitely get challenger with Ryze. It's just you need to be very honest with yourself and realize that you are making the game quite hard for yourself, and to kind of, yeah, like you really need to be better than your elo, I guess. Like not a ton better, right? But let's say you're like a gold 2 player on average. If you play Ryze, say you're maybe like gold 3 or something, right? So he's definitely a bit of an elo deflation champion as opposed to like an elo inflation champion. Like some of these S tiers will be where, a champion like Ahri might put you like a couple ranks above kind of like your average skill level. Seraphine's another champion that I think is pretty decent. Tempted to put her somewhere around here. I think sort of similar to Karma. She brings a lot to the team and she always brings value. That being said, I think she has more difficult matchups than Karma. Also think it's a bit harder for her to get mid prior than Karma. And finally, I feel like Karma just does what Seraphine does a little bit better and a little more consistently. So I actually think maybe Seraphine is a bit better than this, but when Karma exists, there's not really any reason to pick Karma over Seraphine, at least not in my opinion. But yeah, if you're a Seraphine one trick, I think it can absolutely work. There are definitely some difficult matchups, like I think Yone, Fizz, maybe some of the other assassins could be quite hard for you. But if you can get out of the early game versus these champions, I think you do very well into them, although you can't really sideline. But yeah, she's just like a consistent, reasonable value pick. But again, there are certainly better ones. Now, Set used to be a lot better than he is now. I'm honestly tempted to put him in the S tier counter, but I feel like he doesn't quite get that. I feel like Set, he's probably like a mid B most of the time. I think if you get against like ranged champions, he's not quite as good, especially in like the farming meta. If you're against a melee champion though, he's probably a bit higher, maybe like an A tier. Again, he's just like a solid pick. He is pretty blind pickable. He does bring a lot of value, but he just doesn't quite, I don't know, he just like doesn't quite hit the mark like he used to. I think there are better options if you want this sort of playstyle, but yeah, he's a decent champion. And we got some funny ones for you here. So Singed, I think Singed is an S tier counterpick. Singed deals really, really well with the mobile mages. He makes team fighting extremely difficult for them, and he actually has the tools against a lot of them to survive the lane. So some of the ones that are more difficult, you can get away with just going like Time Warp Tonic, TP, and Corrupting Pot and actually just surviving. And then there are also some mages that can't really punish you early. So champs like Zoe or Vex maybe. And against these champions, you do super well into them in team fighting. So I really like Singed, and I think he definitely has a place. And if you see the right opportunity to pick him, or if you've just always been a Singed enthusiast, I think he's really good. So definitely another champ that you can consider. Something that's also very similar to this is I'd say Sion. I think Sion is probably an S tier counterpick and also quite strong just as a blind pick. Maybe like in the A tier or something. I think Sion against champions with low wave clear, where you can spam push them in and just like keep farming camps. And just like build, you can build full tank or you can build lethality. I think both the builds are very valuable. I think the only thing Sion really struggles against is champs that are going to shove him in a lot. Because like then it's sort of hard to accelerate yourself, like you can't really hit the tower and you can't really farm camps. So yeah, for the most part, I think Sion is actually very strong, probably A tier without counter and S tier with it. So another very strong champion, and also one that people won't expect. If you pick a Sion, they're probably thinking it's top, and you can get some pretty good mid matchups with it. Swain, so this is after the Swain update. I'm honestly not too sure. I feel like this is one I'm going to have to update a little bit later. I think, again, he's just kind of like in the middle of B tier. Like, he seems strong, but there are just like other stronger picks. Like, are you really going to pick him over some of these ones up here? I'm not sure. I think potentially he could be an A tier once like he's just like a bit more figured out, and the items are a bit more figured out. So I really want to come back to this one. I haven't played enough Swain, and I haven't seen enough Swain played to really make a really good judgment on him. I think looking at his kit in general, he should be pretty decent in Season 12, so I could definitely see him rising up the ranks. But for now, I'm just kind of cautiously putting him at B tier. But we'll see kind of how over the next like patch or two, I think we'll have a really, really good idea of how his kind of like strength works out. Sylas, definitely an A tier champion. Sylas has a ton of carry potential. I think he's also getting buffs, or he already got buffs, I think. Actually, can't remember. It was in this patch, right? I think Sylas got buffed in this patch, and I think he was already pretty strong. I think Sylas's only real weakness is he has some very, very difficult meta matchups. So stuff like Yasuo was recently buffed really hard. A lot of these assassins, not all of them, have the ability to kill him really easily. So I think Sylas is one of these where he's probably an S tier as a counter, but he's also just so strong that he's probably like A tier in general, and I think he's a really, really good solo queue champ. So if you had the opportunity to use Sylas as a counter pick in your pool, I think that's a bit better. But if you are blinding like Sylas, I think this is fine as well. It's just, yeah, there are some of the meta matchups that are sort of hard. Like I think Kassadin counters you hard. Yasuo and Yoran can be quite difficult. I think also some of these assassins are very, very like skill based. Like if you're better, maybe you can do it. But also it's like if you verse something like Ignite Irelia, Ignite Lucian. Well, Ignite Lucian would be really hard actually. Yeah, so there's a lot of these matchups where they're going to be very, very close. They could depend a lot on the jungler. So I think he's better as a counter pick, but just a really good champion overall. Syndra, I feel like Syndra is kind of like a low A. I feel like she's a bit better than some of the other mages because she does bring like very high snowball ability. She can get solo kills. She has gank set up, and she has a lot of like tools to kind of keep herself safe. Well, she doesn't have mobility. I think her stun, if used well, can keep her safe a lot. The only reason I'd say she's A is again like a lot of these assassins are very difficult for Syndra, and the mages, which Syndra's much better at, are just like not picked as much. They're a bit lower tier. So again, Syndra could be one of those where maybe she's an S tier counter or an A plus, probably more like an A plus counter. And just if you're going to pick Syndra all the time, she's pretty good. I really like Syndra, but she, again, just not quite as strong as everything else. But she has benefited from the Season 12 changes as a whole. I think like the full pen itemization is quite good on her. Having a game that's more focused around 1v1, less skirmishing in the very early game is quite good for her. So yeah, there's a lot of good things going for her. And there are also some of the like meta picks that she's quite good against. Like I think she's quite good against Vex. I think if you take Cleanse, she's quite good against Ahri. But yeah, there are also plenty of meta matchups that she's not that good against. So yeah, that's kind of my opinion on Syndra. Talon, I would probably put somewhere near the high A tier, probably maybe around here. I feel like Talon can snowball games really hard. I'd actually be tempted to even put Talon in a low A plus. I feel like he should kind of be more along here. I think Talon's really, really good. And the main reason you don't see Talon more is because he's actually just better in the jungle. And that's the main reason to not pick Talon mid, is just because like he has a better role to be picked in. But I think Talon is pretty damn good. Just like Talon's playstyle in general, snowballs really well, carries games. I think the only bad thing about Talon is he's maybe not super good for learning the game. I don't think he's as unique as a champion like Pyke, but he's definitely not as kind of just like transferable skill-wise as some of the other champs. Like I think Qiyana is much better at just like testing your fundamentals as a whole. And even Qiyana's not the best example, but I think Talon is kind of like starting to get closer to this is like its own champion. It doesn't really play like anything else. So yeah, strong champion solo queue, not super good for learning in my opinion, but if you play a lot of assassins, then you might find it quite good, because like he's going to apply to all your other assassin champions. So yeah, pretty strong champ overall. Tristana, another champion that's an S tier counter pick. If you can get a good matchup for Tristana, you can absolutely just like snowball the game. The things that mainly make blind picking Tristana difficult is you can get countered compositionally a lot. But Tristan's really, really good mid matchup. So like against assassins, if you take exhaust, they can very rarely kill you. Against mages, most of the time you can just jump on them. Although there are some that do well into you, like for example, Victor with his W, Syndra with her stun, like Cassio also. Yeah, so actually thinking about it a bit more, there are a lot of the meta mages that are a bit more difficult for you, like Ahri can charm you, Vex can CC you. But against like some of the other mages, so I think like your Orianas, Swains, there's a lot of mages that you can just jump on and kill. But these melee champions, there's a ton of them you can bully out. You really need to be able to snowball the game to be good as Tristana. Oh, let me just check. Is my cam covering this? Yeah, I'm gonna start thinking about that. Yeah, basically I think Trist, she's quite good as a counter pick, but definitely not a champ that you can pick all the time. Tryndamere, surprise, surprise, another top tier, like S tier counter pick. I think Tryndamere just like absolutely destroys champs that can't deal with him, particularly champs with weak laning phases or low CC. But yeah, he does sort of struggle against a lot of the meta picks, you know, Everfrost users, champs with lots of mobility, like I think Ahri, LeBlanc, Vex, all quite hard for Tryndamere. So I probably wouldn't go ahead and blind pick him mid lane, although maybe you can pick him and people will think he's top. So you could maybe get away with that, but I think he is just sort of much better as a counter pick. Twisted Fate, I sort of think he's a bit of a low A tier. Twisted Fate has been hit a lot, and I think there are kind of better roaming champions than him now, but he's still a pretty good choice. He can carry games. He has like really good like fundamental training, especially if you want to play like side laning and like roaming champions. So I think TF is still pretty good. I think Galio is just like the better roaming champion at the moment, but don't really have anything bad to say about TF other than that some of his matchups are pretty difficult. Although you won't counter them that much, it's more like some of these assassin counter picks that are pretty hard. Although you can manage them, like I think TF's actually pretty good at managing bad matchups. I guess another thing is a lack of mobility, but it's never really been a problem for TF because you're not a champion that really needs to get in there. And I think also you're not playing so aggressive in lane that you should be worried about ganking all the time. I think maybe if you're really good at TF, he could potentially be a bit higher, but I think it'd be a lot easier for you just to choose a champion like Galio. But overall, he's still A tier, right? Like he's still a strong champion. So Veigar, finally putting another one in the S tier. I think Veigar is super, super strong against like the meta matchups. He's like completely fine. He actually counters like, or like soft counters Ahri, I would say. So that's another big one. A lot of these assassin matchups, you can just like AFK early game and just like AFK from your tower and you can't be punished super hard. And then in team fights, you deal with him super well. He also scales like an absolute monster, and he has some just like some builds that just make playing in some like straight up unfun. Like he can go tank and still just like one shot you. So I think Veigar, extremely strong pick at the moment, definitely worth having in your pool because he counters so much of like the meta, like these short range, lots of melee champs and bruisers running around. He's an Everfrost champion as well. Like he uses the current itemizations really well. So yeah, there's just like so many good things about Veigar at the moment. Absolutely an S tier champion. So Vel'Koz, I'm not too sure about Vel'Koz. I feel like he's kind of mid B tier, but after the buffs, he actually might be a bit higher. I'm not too sure. I feel like Vel'Koz really struggles matchup wise mid, especially blind pick. Maybe if you use him as a counter pick, he could be a bit higher, maybe A tier. But I think Vel'Koz sort of falls into that thing of just like he doesn't really have a niche. Like he's sort of a poke champion, but also deals with tanks. But like there are other champions that deal with tanks, and there are other champs that poke better. So I don't really feel like he has an identity. I think he is much better as an AD or a support because he has much better matchups down there and can actually snowball lanes a lot harder. So another one of those decent champions. If you really like Vel'Koz, I think you can do well with him, but they're a much easier and more rewarding pick. The Victor is really, really good. I'd say he's probably like a low A+. So the thing about Victor is Season 12 has benefited him a lot. Victor has always had very, very strong scaling and very, very strong 1v1, but where he really lacked was in some of the previous metas where there was like lots of difficult assassin matchups, and also in metas where there was a lot of skirmishing early. So now that these are less of a thing, like I think the current meta, like you can see, two of these S tiers, right, are strong mages. There are still some assassins up here, obviously, but a lot of these can be dealt with. And looking at most of these, I think Victor does pretty well against. There are some difficult ones like Fizz, for example, but most of them are pretty good. And Victor's scaling and 1v1 super, super nice. So yeah, I really like Victor at the moment. I think he's just like a really good overall pick for learning the game, for like carrying games. And yeah, I definitely have like a soft spot for Victor. I played a lot of him in the past, and I think he's like a pretty valuable champ for everyone to have in their champion pool. Now we have Vlad. I'd also put Vlad somewhere in the A+ tier, maybe about here actually. I feel like Vlad is really, really good. I think he's blind pickable. I think he functions as a counter pick. He's got good itemization. He can carry games. He's got like a ton of stuff going for him. Maybe the only bad thing about Vlad is that he's a little slow. Like, not so much in terms of like your weak early game, but it's more that in the early game, you have these like windows of extreme power. So when you've got like Flash, Ult, Ignite, you can get kills, but then you have this like down period where if there's any fighting during that time, you're sort of useless. But Vlad is really, really good because if he ever does get a single kill, even if it's not like if you're playing against a Vlad and the Vlad gets a kill, it's really, really hard for you to play from that point. because he has like infinite sustain. He's stronger than you, like he can burst you easily, and he's just snowballs and scales super well. It's a very unforgiving champion to play against, so I really like him. But if the game is too fast paced, he can kind of run the risk of being outperformed in the early game. But again, Season 12 slowed down games quite a bit, so I think a lot of the time Vladimir can get away with this, and yeah, overall really strong champion. Xayah unfortunately joins the boys in the B tier, or sorry, the D tier. So I think Xayah, when she got like when the AD what's it called? AD lethality, like poke build became good. I think she was really strong. She kind of like fit the same sort of playstyle that Lucian does, but again, now that she's been nerfed, I guess she's like actually probably better than these champs. Or about here, I'd say. Actually, I should rearrange this. I'd say it's more like this. Why can't I move? Okay, so yeah, more like this. Yeah, I think the only kind of issue is just she's been nerfed like a bit too much to where her poke not as quite as potent as before, and also I think there are other AD champions that are very similar that do better things. Like I think Tristana functions as a better counter pick, Lucian and Akshan function as like better just AD picks. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of Xayah anymore. I don't really recommend playing. This might surprise a lot of people, but I think Xerath is actually an A+ champion. I think it's rare that you see more than one poke champion kind of like be this high, but right now the current the Bezos build on Xerath, where you go like First Strike, Futures Market, I think you also take Treasure Hunter. Basically, like you have the ability to build this full damage greedy build and accelerate your gold to insane levels, and that's made Xerath like a really strong pick at the moment. I also think he is one of the few mid laners that can actually impact the map without really compromising his own lane. So champions like Lux and champions like Xerath, they can walk halfway down the river and oftentimes snipe kills or like an assist a skirmish, whereas another kind of like control mage doesn't really have the ability to walk down all the way because they just don't have strong enough wave clear to give themselves enough time to walk bot without losing anything. So I really like Xerath. He is good against some of the meta picks. There's a lot of kind of picks where you can kind of just outrange them again, sort of like Veigar AFK farm at the tower, but also some of these assassin matchups would be quite hard for you. But yeah, again, there are also some good ones, so I like him overall. Maybe a little bit better as a counter pick than a blind pick, but still pretty decent. So Yasuo, I would say, is somewhere in the high A. I'd say probably after his buffs, he's about here. I think the only thing that, like, okay, Yasuo has some pretty tough matchups at the moment. I think like these Everfrost champions are very hard to deal with. Some of these higher up champions are also quite hard to deal with. But I think the main reason Yasuo is so high is because he's just like insanely strong 1v1, farms really fast. But again, like these matchups are difficult. I think he is better as a counter pick. Also think if you compare him with Diana, he goes to like an S+. So if you get Yasuo Diana, that's really, really good. I'd say probably like A tier as a blind pick, or maybe even B tier as a blind pick, but definitely like A+, or even S as a counter pick, or in like the niche situations where you have Diana as well. So if you're a Yasuo one trick, I think he's definitely a champ that you can play pretty much all the time. Most Yasuo matchups, if you have good enough skill on Yasuo, can be dealt with. And I think the itemization for him at the moment is really good. So yeah, he's pretty strong, especially after the buffs. Yone as well, I think Yone is a bit more blind pickable than Yasuo, but not as strong as Yasuo in his kind of like best scenarios. I'd say like Yone at his best probably only ever reaches an A+, whereas like Yasuo might reach an S. But I think Yone is like overall a bit more versatile. The bad matchups aren't as bad for him, but also his good matchups aren't as good for him. There's a lot of ways to use Yone. You could use him as a counter pick to champions that are kind of like weak early, so where you can get some free scaling. Or you could just like blind pick him. Some people will think it's Yone top. It is one of those champions that you can flex between mid and top, so that's kind of nice if you want to be a Yone one trick. You got a lot of good things about him. He's also got much better gank setup, I would say. Like Yasuo's is a bit unreliable, but I think Yone's is really, really good, so he can kind of punish a lot of these immobile champions. So yeah, I really like both these champs, honestly. I think Yone is significantly easier, and like you're not losing that much for playing him, so I feel like it's better. But if you enjoy Yasuo, I'd kind of go for him as well. And another thing is like there's a lot of transferable skills between them, although Yasuo, again, significantly harder. But it's a kind of situation where if you play one, you can probably play the other as well, or at least consider learning the other. So yeah, they're pretty good. Now Zed, I'm a little torn on because I think Zed before was definitely an S tier, but I believe he just received some nerfs just before. I feel like, yeah, maybe it's too much to put Zed in S. I feel like he's a very high A+ though. Zed is a really good AD champion because he's one of the few AD assassins that can farm from range, even in bad matchups, and not suffer for it. So if you look at some of the other AD picks, like let's say Talon. if Talon's in a bad matchup, he has to use his W, which is his main trading tool and has a fairly long cooldown to get CS, right? And he also has to go melee, not melee range, but it's like quite short range, right? Like he has to move up for it. And that's like a window that's very easy to punish. A Zed, on the other hand, he has like a very short cooldown. He has energy rather than mana. Like his Q, you normally trade with WEQ and you don't trade that much without it. So what you can do, you can WEQ like for the trade, and then while your W's on cooldown, you can just farm with Q. So it actually makes Zed really, really hard to lane against. Much more difficult than a lot of the other AD assassins. So yeah, I really like Zed. He's good against a lot of like the mage champions. Again, maybe a bit better as a counter pick, but I think Zed's a champion that you could play every single game if you wanted. Another thing is that Zed works extremely well with the AP junglers. So if you have a combo like Zed Evelyn, I'd definitely say S tier. There's a lot of AP junglers that he pairs really well with. I think if you play Zed with an AD jungler, he's not quite as strong. I'd maybe take him down to A tier. But yeah, if you can get that kind of like AD mid, AP jungler pairing with something that's quite strong, I think he is really, really good. And he's definitely the most blind pickable AD mid laner, or AD assassin mid laner, sorry. And yeah, even in these like more difficult matchups, he has the tools to farm it out. And in the ones that are good for him, like he can snowball really hard and eventually reach a point where it's just sort of like not much the opponent can do against you. Ziggs has really, really high potential. If you can snowball the game consistently with Ziggs, it goes really well. But the problem is, I think it's like too much coordination for solo queues. So the way Ziggs is sometimes used mid and competitive, although not for a while, is what people would do is they would make sure they get the first herald and then they just rotate Ziggs around the map, taking a ton of towers. If you want an example of this, I think it was like Knight Ziggs in season 11, I'm thinking. So if you go look that up, you should be able to find the VOD, but he just like gets an absolutely like insane, absurd gold lead on Ziggs like really early in the game just by rotating around and knocking down all the towers. But the problem is it requires too much coordination. This is a champ where if you're playing Clash or something, you could definitely play Ziggs and make it work. But I think in solo queue, like again, there are just like way better picks. There are way better poking champs as well. And I guess Ziggs and solo queue is a bit more suited for bot lane. So yeah, not a champion I'd recommend too highly, but maybe if you're duoing with someone or you're playing like Clash or something and you can consistently kind of coordinate this, then Ziggs can go up in value a lot, maybe to A. Maybe like a mid-A, I would say. Yeah, something like that. Zilean, also very high value champion. Tempted to put him kind of like low in the A+, maybe about here. So yeah, I think Zilean is really, really good champion. Consistently gets a lot of value. Very good against a lot of the meta champs. Very good with a lot of the meta champs. So he's just like really strong overall. Again, Zilean, a very big beneficiary of a slower game, less skirmishing, and that like first 5 minutes in season 12. I think most of the meta matchups, whether they're mages or assassins, Zilean can deal with fine. There's some where you get pushed in a lot, but you can always like AFK wave clear your tower, so I don't think he has any problems with any of that. So yeah, overall, Zilean, pretty strong champion, very versatile. You can blind pick him, you can counter pick him, and also you can play him in multiple roles. So another champion that's really worth learning. Also uses the current itemization really, really well. So yeah, very underrated champion to be honest, and should be played a lot more. Zach, I'm not even sure if I should put Zach on the list because I feel like I never see him. I think Zach could potentially be an S tier counter pick mid. I think there's a lot of mids that can't really deal with Zach. Again, like a mobile mages that don't have much wave clear. Honestly, very similar to Sion, where you can kind of punish them with your gank setup and they don't have the tools to kind of punish you early game. I don't think I've seen a Zach mid in a while, but I think, yeah, it's just very similar to Sion. Actually does have some potential. But not a champion that I think is like worth learning. And it'd be, again, if you play Zach jungle already, you could consider playing him mid, like as a tank. I probably wouldn't recommend playing him full AP, but I think if you played him as a tank, similar to tank Sion, where you like punish your mobiles, you have like some decent wave clear, you can roam, you can farm camps and stuff. So yeah, has potential, but definitely not the greatest champion and not something I'd recommend picking outside of a counter pick. Zoe, I'd say Zoe's somewhere around about here. I feel like, or maybe a little bit higher, maybe about here. Yeah, I'm thinking about here. Yeah, about here, I'd say. Zoe's a pretty good champ. She deals well in just like with solo queue in general. Like a lot of her bad lanes can be mitigated easily. Also, the sums that drop can change your lane drastically. She snowballs really, really well. She is a bit difficult to play, and I think also she struggles against some team comps. Ones with sustain, ones with hard engage. You know, there's a lot of difficult things for Zoe. But I think she is really, really good in solo queue and one of those champs where if you're one trick, you can pick her all the time. So it's always one of those champs that even when she gets like nerfed, like sort of just sticks around. And I also think she benefits quite a lot from the current itemization of like the full pen builds. So yeah, pretty good champion overall, deals fairly well with the meta, although there are some comps like hard engaged. I'm thinking stuff like Jarvan. Yeah, I guess like Jarvan, Leona, Ornn, also tankier team comps can be more difficult for Zoe to play, but I think you don't see that many tanks nowadays. So yeah, overall, most of the time, she's pretty damn good. Akshan, I feel like Akshan should go right about here. Akshan is pretty good. I feel like Lucian is a tiny bit better, but honestly, I feel like for a lot of people, it's personal preference. I also think Akshan is significantly easier than Lucian, but they do a very similar thing, although Akshan offers a bit more to the team. Lucian definitely a more selfish pick, but does like come with higher reward. So both of these, they have a very similar playstyle. They have a very similar effect on the game. So a lot of what I said that for Lucian kind of applies where you can bully a lot of the matchups, whether they're range champions, whether they're melee champions, and the kind of more difficult things for you is going to be the team comps. So if they have stuff like Malphites, Wukongs, and also there's a lot of champs where if you have the tools to be ahead of them, so let's say Lucian or Akshan versus champs like Talon, you can like destroy them in the early game, but if you do make a mistake, you die to a gank and stuff like that, it's very unforgiving, and these good matchups can like turn to bad matchups very quickly if you make mistakes. So they are quite unforgiving, but if you play them well, like they definitely have a huge return for solo queue. Finally, we have Vex. So Vex is another definitely S tier champion. I feel like she should maybe go I feel like these are pretty interchangeable. I think Vex is super, super good, counters so much of the meta, and like a lot of her difficult matchups, you can just like chill out and like wait for a gank or even solo kill, like if your opponent makes a mistake. So I think Vex is still super, super strong. Surprised that she hasn't really been touched yet. Although if Ahri hasn't been nerfed, like, you know, maybe Vex doesn't need a nerf. But she absolutely does. She's super, super strong. Uses itemization currently really, really well as well. Also, one thing that's kind of interesting at the moment is that all these S tier champions are not that hard to play, or at least to pick up. So yeah, that's like quite good because right now it's really easy for you to pick up any of these S tier champions and have like a really high impact on them. I will say that maybe Vex compared to the other champions is a little less blind pickable. Like I think she struggles a bit harder with the more difficult range matchups, so longer range mages than some of the other ones do. But she's still strong enough that you could just blind pick her most of the time. But personally, like the way I pick my champs right now, I blind pick Ahri, and Vex is a champion that's like high on my counter list. But if you only play Vex, or you know, like you play Vex but not some of the other blind picks, she's absolutely fine to blind pick. It's just maybe there's a little more blind pick value somewhere else. But overall, like absolutely S tier champion, destroys melee champs, destroys short range compositions, also does well against a mobile like mages that aren't too strong in the lane phase, but some of the like stronger, longer range mages in lane, so like Syndra's, Orianna's, they can be quite hard to lane against. But if you do get out of this lane phase, you do quite well into them, as long as you're not at a like really, really big deficit. So guys, this is the finished tier list. I've actually turned off my cam so you guys can see the whole thing, and what I'll do is I'll put this as an image in the description below, so if you just want to save this for yourself. So I kind of want to just like talk about this in general. So again, I want to reiterate, you can reach Challenger with any champion on this list. There are obviously some that are more difficult than others. There's some that are better for learning than others. So there's a lot of like nuance to it. And overall, I think you shouldn't worry about champion pool too much. It's much more important to focus on like the fundamentals and stuff like that than it is to just like you know, play a champ that you don't really enjoy for some temp elo. I really think that it's much better to be playing a champ that you enjoy and like focusing on learning the game than it is to just like temporarily boost yourself up and then like fall back down when that champion gets nerfed. That's just my opinion. Like obviously a lot of the stronger tier champions have remained strong for a long time, so you can keep playing them for a long time. You know, like oftentimes they just don't get nerfed. Riot does have their kind of like favorite child thing going on. And finally, like this is my opinion, you know, like other people are going to disagree. I don't play every champion on this list, you know, like I can't, right? There's so many here. I don't play them all regularly. I will say I've played against all of these. I would say like quite a bit over like my time playing League. You know, I've played for a long time. I've played through a lot of metas, and I think I also have a pretty good grasp of like how solo queue goes. So even the champions that maybe I don't play, I think I have a pretty good idea on them. But obviously you're probably going to get more detailed information from actual one tricks on the champion. But yeah, if you feel like I've missed a champion, maybe let me know. And also if you have any kind of like questions about the champion specifically, you can ask me below and let me know if you want this more regularly. I feel like if I did this for each patch, I would probably only really talk about if champs move around rather than talking about the whole thing. But this, I think, like it's updated for patch 12.8, but I want you guys to see this as this is a season 12 mid lane tier list. And there's like, unless there are big changes to these champions, I think they will mostly remain within their tiers, unless there's, you know, big changes to itemization, the meta, or the champions themselves. So yeah, let me turn my cam back. So yeah, that is going to be it for this video, guys. Hopefully it was helpful for you all. If you did like it, go ahead and like and subscribe, and please let me know below if you have any questions or any opinions. Again, I'd actually be interested to hear your opinions as people that play in different elos. And yeah, just like kind of let me know how that goes. And yeah, I'd be kind of interested to hear your opinions as people that play like all across different elos. It's possible that like some of these like real like low elo terror like champions that don't see as much play at high tier, although I've tried to be pretty fair, I think. So yeah, anyway guys, thanks for watching, like and subscribe, let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys next time.